Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us on this webinar. My name is Tara Ritter, and I'm a Program Associate at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Just so you all know, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on IATP's website and YouTube channel afterwards. I'm happy to be here with Gijs Kuneman, who is joining us all the way from the Netherlands. Gijs is the director of CLM, which is the Center for Agriculture and Environment. CLM is a green consultancy in the Netherlands working on sustainable farming. Gijs was trained as an agronomist and has worked in environmental organizations in Brussels and the Netherlands before his current position at CLM. Today he's going to lead us through a presentation on different greenhouse gas accounting tools and how they might be improved and given more depth in the future. So the slide that you see is showing how to ask questions. There will be about 10 minutes for questions in the middle of the presentation and about 10 more minutes for questions at the end. You're able to ask questions by typing in the text box on your control panel, which is located by default on the right side of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And with that, let's turn it over to you, Gijs.
Well, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. I'll show you my screen. You can see the mess I'm in here. I had it at the first screen, so this is what this usually occurs. I'm just going to flick through this. Good start. As I said, good morning to you, good afternoon to me. My name is Gijs, and I'm going to go through this presentation in about half an hour, I hope. Don't be fooled by the accent. I'm Dutch, used to work with a lot of Brits, so I've copied that one without being able to really copy your American accent. You just laugh. And I also realized that I make this presentation in quite a large font because it's generally made for rooms, so you can lean back from your screen because I'll be using lots of big letters. And if there's any young people around in the audience, I'm sorry, there's no YouTube films included. It's just text and pictures. Well, given that, what I'll be doing is the following. Very briefly about us, so you know who we are, what we're doing. Quite a big chunk about climate and agriculture and how they interact. And I'm well aware that some of you know all this and that you'll have to sit through this. And there may be others who are not entirely informed about this, so I will be going through those sheets pretty quickly. Hopefully you can keep up with me, and if it's really going too fast, you can always give a signal to the organizer. Then we'll have a look at carbon calculators, just a few of them, and not very much in depth because that would mean going into Excels and everything. Then we'll have a break because I'll be hoarse by speaking for half an hour, give you time to ask some questions. Ending up at the end for a few more minutes about more than just carbon, going beyond it and including other stuff like biodiversity into farm level tools. That's what I'm going to do in the next half hour. This is CLM. We're an organization in existence for about 30 years in sustainable food and farming, bridge building, advice and research is our work, and we own ourselves. We do from the start. Starting out as a non-profit, there's still a foundation at the moment. There's also a company which I'm heading, 22 people. And we do have a specialty. We're very good at measuring, monitoring and benchmarking, putting sustainable agriculture into numbers, into practical numbers, into standards so that farmers or policy people or companies can compare them. That's one of the things that we're talking about today. And we work, that's great fun, we work for virtually everybody. We work for big companies, for smaller companies. You see a few mentioned here. Governments, sometimes EU level, mostly national and regional level, but also for farmers and also for environmental organizations. So imagine at this moment we're running a project for Bayer, the chemical company, on pesticides, and we're also working for Greenpeace at the moment on pesticides. It does mean that we're somewhere in the middle between those two. And what we do is try and connect those worlds. We understand society, I mean NGOs and citizens. We understand policy, we understand the food chain partners, that's companies and retail. We also talk to farmers in the fields. And that connection we're good at because we speak languages of all those worlds. And as Tara said, we work mainly in the Netherlands, but we're moving towards other countries internationally, for instance with the SIDE platform and the Pool Farm Alliance. and I assume that you know what SAI platform is, but if you don't, it's the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform, starting out about 12 years ago with a few companies and currently encompassing 70 multinationals in food. And they're serious about advancing their sourcing, the products they buy towards sustainable farming. So I find that promising. And the Cool Farm Alliance, you'll be seeing more about that later on in the presentation. Way before I was here at CLM, there already were warm contacts with IATP in the past, and there have been several exchanges in person in the Netherlands and in the US. So you could say that we're sisters. Well, to the contents then. Agriculture and climate change. This is an old graph, numbers from 2007, but it was a clear one, seeing that agriculture worldwide is a serious source of greenhouse gas emissions. Not the biggest one, but not the smallest one either. Serious to look at. And if you look at what comes out of the land, that is land use, you can see that forest land, the deforestation, clearing of forest, is the major source of CO2 emissions from the land, and burning biomass too, but agriculture still is a quarter of those emissions. And that means there's a lot to be gained by, for instance, improving soil management on farms. And it also means that you can actually reverse the emissions into sequestration, to fixing CO2. These are graphs from the continents and the emissions or removals of carbon from the soil or from land use. You can see in Africa, America and Asia, we're still emitting a lot of CO2 equivalents, but in Europe we're actually fixing more carbon that we're emitting. That's probably because there's more and more forests in Europe, not necessarily because farmers are fixing it in the soil. They're not very good at that yet. And in Africa, the Americas and Asia, there still is clearing of forest, there still is a lot of land development, agriculture moving into what used to be nature areas, logically leading to a lot of land use change and therefore emissions of CO2. And that happens, for instance, in China, India and Brazil, mainly because these are, again, emissions from land use. And also in the US, which did surprise me, because I thought you sort of put everything into agriculture already, your land. Clearly there's still a lot of emissions there. But today's focus at farm level only. I'll be talking about farmers and what they can do, and agriculture only, not afforestation or cleaning of land. We're not talking about consumers, even if they sometimes can have an enormous impact on climate change, by not eating meat, for instance. And we're not talking about food waste, which of course is one of the major sources if you're losing 33% of your food. All of that has caused climate change without actually ending up as food, which is a waste. But we're not talking about that, because if you look at very general average emissions of greenhouse gases, they occur while you're cooling or preparing food or dishwashing, and they occur at farm level. Sometimes 30, but sometimes even 90% of the emissions are in the farm. So if you want to do something about climate change and farming, you've got to be on the farm. And there's a challenge, there's an opportunity, and there's an urgency, because farming, agriculture is one of the causes of climate change. We looked at that just now. It's also one of the sectors most hit by the consequences, and it's part of the solution. And there's few sectors who do all three at the same time. It causes emissions of the three major greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, laughing gas, nitrous oxide, and methane. It suffers the consequences of droughts, weather extremes, shifting patterns of pests and diseases, and move along with the climate shifting, longer growing seasons, positive effect of climate change for farming sometimes. And they're part of the solution, farmers, because they can fix carbon in the soil and also in hedges and trees and other landscape elements. And they can help produce biomass. So an interesting, intricate collection of challenges there. Of course, we'd like to reduce the emissions, we'd like to adapt to climate change, and we'd like to optimize the fixing of carbon on the soils, optimizing biomass especially, because there's of course a conflict. If you extract a lot of biomass from farming, you may extract too much carbon from the soil, and that leads to a net set of emissions. So we'll look at the three of them, at the emissions, at the consequences, adaptation, and at the solution. This is the main source of greenhouse gas in farming. It's what the cow emits, mostly from the front, some of it from the back, and it's inevitable. A graph from the FAO again, you see the brownish largest bit is enteric fermentation. That's the methane that the cow burps while producing milk from grass, and it's inevitable. It's part of its metabolism. It's in fact the only way of producing milk. But there is an efficiency that can be improved. There's still a 10 to 15% reduction of that is possible with efficiency improvements. And there's other big chunks. There's fertilizers, which leads to emissions of nitrous oxide. There's methane from rice cultivation. There's methane from manure management and pasture. And of course there's CO2 from burning. What's probably not in these graphs, and which is very important as well for the farmer, is the energy embedded in the inputs, and notably fertilizers. Because fertilizers, especially nitrogen, cost enormous amount of energy to produce. And in statistics, they're not part of the farming stage. In the climate statistics, the production of fertilizers is industry. And so any reductions in that emission is to the benefit, to the glory of the industry. It does it, even if a farmer would be helping to reduce it. So in our work, we keep it in. We keep talking about the embedded energy in fertilizers, part of the scope of solutions for farmers. Efficiency increases will help reduce emissions, and I've just put a few examples in here. In dairy, for instance, farmers have a sort of reserve herd of younger cows, heifers, eventually going to produce milk. If you reduce the number of that, you increase a bit of risk, business risk, but you do reduce a lot of emissions because these animals produce greenhouse gas but not milk. It's one of the steps that we've noticed with farmers in the Netherlands who've taken first, because it's an efficiency that also saves money. In crops, for instance, splitting the application of fertilizer into two or three smaller phases, so not putting a lot of fertilizer on the land in one go, will reduce emissions. And precision farming can also help increase production per hectare, which helps per kilogram and per hectare reduce emissions. I had to find an order of magnitude, and I put these 10%, 25% numbers in. This is not science. This is what we noticed in the Netherlands. In dairy, we were able to reduce emissions by 10% by taking a range of measures on the farm. And I imagine that in extensive arable growing, like arrow crops, it is possible to reduce emissions by a quarter, because it is possible to increase production by a quarter. That means you could reduce emissions per kilogram of product by improving the yield. Of course, in kilograms of CO2 in absolute numbers, it's still the same. Adaptation, so adapting to climate change means taking measures like soil management, water management, crop management, choose varieties, and the choice of crops. Sounds very logical, but the latter one, the choice of crops, is an interesting one, because there's still a lot of habit in putting crops where they don't belong. Farmers who put potatoes in waterlogged land where they can hardly harvest it, or farmers who grow cotton in places where there's hardly any water. It is time that we consider not growing crops in particular regions, and it is time, and I've talked to companies like Coca-Cola who did say the similar thing, say, should we be sourcing sugar or other materials from places where they shouldn't be farming at all? And that means, you know, if you change the market, you've changed demand, you may change the habits of farmers. Tantalizing on one. Fixing carbon in soils and in plants, sequestration. I've done a back of an envelope calculation. Again, not science, be careful to quote this because it's probably not correct, but I just wondered how big is the scope for farming to help climate change? Given that there's 48 billion square kilometers, or 4,800 billion hectares, assuming that some of that land cannot fix CO2 because it's peatland, or just not feasible, but given, just roughly assuming that 4,000 billion hectares can fix CO2, and a farmer can fix half a ton of CO2 per hectare. If a farmer tries really hard, in Dutch situations, he can fix a full ton of CO2 per hectare over a range of 10 to 20 years, continuing that over the years. So that is not unfeasible. That would equal 2 billion tons of CO2, and that's 5% of global emissions. You were struggling to reduce global emissions by a few percent, and if all farmers would really take care of their soil, you might be able to solve climate change. Just dreaming here, because I know there's a lot of barriers. Because what they could do is leave stubble and crop residue on the land, apply manure and compost, so adding organic material to the soil, reduce soil tillage, that slows down the breaking down of organic materials. Leave cover crops and green manure, again adding organics. Maintain grassland, one of the easiest and best ways of reducing emissions and not cutting down whatever wood is still standing there, as examples of how you could help fix carbon. What not mentioned, of course, is fixing carbon in crops. But that's nonsense, because after a year, all the CO2 fixed in crops will already have been consumed and emitted again by the animals or plant or people who have eaten the crop. So that's not part of the equation. So it's not really, it's very simple really. It's not very complicated. In a nutshell, the advice to the farmer is produce more efficiently while caring for the soil. That's all. Again, you may wonder whether there's a contradiction there, because efficiency and caring for the soil at the moment is not always in the same direction. So there's a trade-off probably, or at least there's a dilemma between efficiency and resilience. And I mean, and that comes back in that climate smart agriculture. I'm moving from science to politics now. There's been a movement called Global Alliance on Climate Smart Agriculture, launched at the UN in September last year. There was not much in the press, but it was actually initiated by my government, not by the US government. It was backed by 75 countries and organizations, and they produced a very good source book in which they explain how this works. And what I hear around, at least here in Europe, from governments, but also from companies, is that, climate smart agriculture, that means intensify production, make it more efficient, produce more milk, more grain, more potatoes per hectare with lower emissions, and then we're doing climate smart things. And I was pleased to read in the guidebook of FAO that there's much more to that. Efficiency and resilience should be pursued together, because on the other side of the equation is resilience. It's increasing diversity in the field. In tropical systems, for instance, not slash and burn, but agroforestry, trying to get more out of the soil by using more diverse crops. Realizing that plants and animals, when they're really put to the test, being extremely productive, they're also very vulnerable to diseases and heat waves. It's a delicate balance, and the efficiency movement goes into, we could say, the top league sport for plants and animals, which is very impressive but also vulnerable. Whereas the resilience school looks more at natural systems and the balance between soil and plants and ecosystems. And that probably even goes beyond the field level. That's where I really get warmed up. We're talking not just the field, nor the farm, we're talking about the region, the system, the watershed, ecologically, but also socially. There's resilience there too. And what I'm anxious about is that these two don't come together, and that there's big forces in the world, from food companies and governments, will say we need more efficient production because we need to feed 9 billion people. So forget your resilience, talk about producing more and more, even with less emissions. So there's also a bell of, I've heard this before, what is climate smart agriculture as compared to sustainable farming as such in general? It's a single issue thing, but it's got a direct link to water availability, soil, nutrient diversity. So is this just sustainable farming all over again, or is it anything new at all? Well, there is a new driver because it's an additional direct risk to farming now. Soil loss is really something new, disease pressure new. Climate change is actually a problem for a farmer if he doesn't deal with it. And so far we've been able to mask poor soil quality or water shortage, nutrient loss by technological fixes, by pumping up water from further away or deeper out of the ground, or by putting in more nutrients even in a poor soil to produce sufficiently. Climate change cannot be fixed by just technology. This is a bigger one. And it's a driver for the landscape approach. It forces people to look at the broader system, the watersheds, and probably the socioeconomic context. So it is not new in the contents. It's the same thing again. Care for the soil, produce more efficiently. But it is a new driver for change. So in the end, after some contemplation, I decided this is a positive thing. By the way, this landscape approach sounds great, but it's very difficult for food companies to look beyond the field and the farm that they're sourcing from, because that's not where their influence is. An interesting point to further discuss, and the Sustainable Food Lab has put that on the agenda in the summit that they're organizing in June. I look at the food chain because I don't know how much you people work with food companies and retail. We do, and I find them a positive factor in sustainability because governments don't do much anymore over here. So why do they worry about sustainability? Well, they've got three reasons. The first is security of supply. Food companies are vulnerable to nature, to natural disasters, to the weather, and they want to secure their supply. They want to be able to sell food in 30 years' time. That's their main worry. And of course, the reputation for the company is an important one as well for the marketing department. And the people I meet often have a genuine personal concern about sustainability. And that may sound a bit lame, but if that genuine concern is also alive in the boardrooms of the companies, that really helps. If the top boss says, we're moving in that direction towards sustainability, that's our company policy. The genuine concern becomes company concern, and then it's a positive force. And I do know that our companies were very positive, and some of them very negative. I'm aware of that. So why do they publish tools? Why are they all working on cool farm tools and other stuff? Well, they want a farmer to help to understand and improve his act so that they know what their sustainability impact is. You know, reminding you of that picture that most of the environmental impact is at farm level. And if food companies are asked, how are you dealing with sustainability? They want to be able to say, we're sourcing from very sustainable farmers. And in order to measure that, they need to have tools. And at some point, they may actually want to publish numbers about their performance. We've reduced water use in our sourcing areas in the south of the US by 10%. And they've got to be able to substantiate that. So you have to have some tools. Interestingly, I just put very randomly 3 companies here who, like most of all food companies and retailers, say climate change, that's a big one. It's often mentioned separately from sustainable sourcing and separate from other environmental issues. And they're very aware that up in the chain at the farm level is where most of the impact is. So they go to the farmer saying, what's your carbon footprint? And the farmer goes, what is it? Why should I know this? And how can I know this? And the food company goes, now here's the calculator, please use it. We're not there yet, but this is a cartoon of what's happening. And the prime focus of these food companies is, as I said, is efficiency. Although some of them are thinking about this larger scale, regional level, watershed level, they are aware that they need to go beyond the field and the farm. But for now, this is about reduce nitrogen and greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of product. I'm moving to the carbon calculator tools, and I'm aware that I'm spending a lot of time, so I'm moving along quickly. There's 3 tools I'm going to have a look at, and the most important one is the Cool Farm tool, because that one is international and broadly supported. So I'm flicking through the other ones as being less important. CLM's Climate Yardstick. Oh no, before I do that, this is what the tools do and what should do. It should be easy to use for the farmer. Without an advisor, should be able to work with it himself. The input should be basic farm data, simple stuff that the farmer has and knows already. And it should provide immediate farm level calculations back to the farmer, graphs and tables, and offer relevant measures saying you can do this and do that to change. It should be interactive, science-based of course, and at the moment the carbon calculator tools are focusing on emissions with some attention to the soil, but not on, for instance, adaptation. This is what a tool generally does. There's always a set of farm data that the farmer can put in. Type of crop, and the yield, and the grazing, yes or no, inputs, and there's background data you need to compare, to calculate. And both the background data and the farm data go into the methodology that you have to choose. You have to decide, let's take this methodology for calculations, leading to an indicator for information about a particular issue. We've made drafts of this kind of flowcharts for several environmental issues. This is the way the calculator is constructed, and this is all the way when you talk to people, you have to, if you compare calculators, you'll have to take this out and say, okay, what's the input, what's the methodology, what's the output. The Climate Yardstick that we produced about 6-7 years ago is very friendly for the user. It's good in animal production, also covers crops, by the way, as a farm level focus, but it's used only in the Netherlands and Denmark, which is why I'm flicking through this quickly, because you're not going to use it. But it's simple. The farmer puts in the number of cows, the milk production, the kind of stables he has, leading to a direct result of graphs showing where the actual emissions take place in ploughing, manure, and the big one, of course, is fermentation, is the methane coming from the cow. And we can also show the different gases, methane, laughing gas, and carbon dioxide. We can even compare farmers, which makes it interesting, because in workshops we can make farmers look at the numbers of their neighbours, which really is a good stimulus for discussion. But as I said, the Climate Yardstick is just European, just national. In the US, there's a very interesting tool for dairy called the Farm Smart, which covers greenhouse gas emissions and energy, specifically for dairy farmers, but it's very US based. But it is worth having a look, because it's using geographic data for the US as well, so that makes it very accurate. I was impressed with the tool when I looked at it a year ago, and it's probably developed further now. As I said, I'm not going to do it deeply, and this one is the one I want to talk a bit more about, because this one is worldwide, aims to cover all crops and regions. It is products-based, not farm-based. That might be a drawback. It's got broad support from industry and an NGO and science, and it's going to be more than just a carbon calculator. This is at the moment a Cool Farm Alliance, several food companies, several academic institutions, and Solidaridad at the right bottom is an international NGO doing a lot of positive work. This is a broad basis. This makes sure that this thing is put out there. It's been used by thousands of farmers already in test phase, from Russia to down in Brazil. So I think this one is here to stay. Overseen by the Aberdeen University, based on several, and this is for the scientists, models, IPCC tier 1 and 2. The fertilizer emissions come from a model made by Fertilizers Europe, and they've got lots of data, of course, themselves. And at the bottom line, you can see it's compliant to what the site platform wants. In other words, the multinationals working together inside platform and said, this is the methodology to prefer, and the Cool Farm tool says, okay, we'll follow that methodology. So it's, in essence, it could be used by several dozens of food companies. When you log on for free and you make your own scenario, your own identity. You get this screen, you can add crop products, farm settings, livestock products, and you fill in, for instance, the crops you have, the yields you have, general information, which is really accessible to the farmer and not very complex to fill in. Of course, you have to tell them how you treat your fields, with what kind of fertilizer, probably even where it's from, with a results page leading to a graph showing the total emissions per source, energy use, fertilizer production, soil fertilizer application. The numbers are to the right and the same numbers are shown in the graph to the left. And the farmer can put in more scenarios. If he changes particular measures, you can see the difference between those scenarios and see where he can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Since I've been speaking so long and we're down half an hour already, I wouldn't mind if you...
Great. Well,
yes.
We've had a couple of questions come in. If anybody has more, feel free to type them into your chat box. One quick logistical question is, there was a slide mentioning 10% reduction and possible 25% reduction. And there's a question whether those reductions are per unit of output or per acre or something else.
That's a good point. The 25% was an indication of increased yield. In other words, if an extensive farmer is able, with the same inputs and the same emissions, to increase yield by 25%, which is possible if he probably applies more precision farming, puts in more efficient varieties, or does something to soil or water management, therefore improves the facility for the plant, you simply have more production per hectare, so with the same emissions. In other words, fewer greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of product, and not, as I said, not in total net absolute numbers, of course. The emissions are still the same, but the amount of product is higher. Is that clear? I hope so. And the one on dairy was actually at farm level. But again, yeah, if you reduce the number of animals that are not productive, that's in absolute numbers a reduction in emissions, and also in relative numbers. So it depends a bit on the measures.
Great. The next question that we have here is, one of the pieces of advice you cited was to maintain grasslands, and management intensive grazing is one approach to this, yet we've concurrently demonized meat. So shouldn't we be better differentiating between types of meat production, like grazing versus confined or industrial?
What we usually say is it's good to eat meat up to a point. It's good to eat meat of grazing animals because they can convert grass into something that we can eat. So that's a good idea. And meat is a byproduct of milk production anyway. So yes, you should be much more careful about what to say. And on the second level, we've calculated that in the Netherlands we can eat 60 grams of pork per day, per person, simply based on the waste products from the food industry in the Netherlands. Food industry may, actually only the part of the food industry that produces food for Dutch people produces so much waste that people can't eat, but pigs can eat, that we're also allowed to eat 60 grams of pork per day. And that's a very good way of turning waste into food. So yes, we should be much more careful how to phrase the bad of meat consumption.
The next question is, have any governments tried to reward farmers for their measurable results?
No, not as far as we know. We've looked at that a few years ago. There have been some attempts of trying to collect voluntary carbon credits for farmers. We've looked at it, but given the price of carbon credits, which is somewhere between 5 or 10 euros or dollars per ton in the official emission trade, and even if you increase it to 20 euros per ton, that would, for a farmer doing his best to fix a ton of carbon per hectare, would get 20 euros per hectare extra. And that's not a huge incentive for a farmer. So because the price is so low, there's no scope from any carbon market. As far as we know, there are some European subsidies for environmentally friendly farming, and that usually covers a range of green and blue services, as we call it. In other words, caring for nature, the environment, and for water quality. And in that package, you could say there's also a public service in climate change. And yes, then you could say there's a bit of government money, but that's as part of a package. It's not specifically for climate change. And there used to be a group called the Climate Farmers of America, who tried to sell carbon credits to the public directly, to individual persons. I know I've seen the sites, but I don't know how they fare and whether or not they're selling anything. By the way, peat soils emit much more carbon, of course, if badly managed. And the scope for reducing, avoiding further breakdown of peat soils could help reduce CO2 emissions substantially. That's probably 5 tons per hectare, an estimate, but that would raise more money. So if you could get a good system of rewarding the right people and not punishing the right people, if you get the system right, you might be able to get some money, as compared to what we're doing with forests nowadays. That in climate change, we raise money for people, for countries, give them actually credit for not cutting down forests. And you could do the same for farmers for not oxidizing their peat soils. So simple words here. I hope that was clear.
We have a question from a farmer who's on the line, and she's using cover crops extensively on 200 acres, and she's been told that she's sequestering carbon, and she'd like to know if that is true or where is the data.
You need to calculate a carbon balance in order to know that. Cover crops, you could say, depending on the crop, that half of the biomass is underground and half of it is above. And some crops have much deeper roots. Alfalfa, for instance, does penetrate very deeply and adds a lot of biomass underground. So it depends on the crop, and it depends on what you do with the crop. If you use it as fodder, you take away a lot of biomass from the soil. The balance might be just neutral or negative. If you plow it under, I'm sure you're adding. So you need to find. We do have a calculator, but I'm not sure if that's in English. What we call the carbon module, in which you can fill in those measures. That's part of the climate yardstick, and we can check if the Cool Farm tool does this as well. If the Cool Farm tool has the same dynamic model that we have, that can add up carbon added to the soil for 30 years. So we can check that. But anyway, you need to find a tool that can calculate the balance, and they can prove it. I think it sounds like she's doing a good thing in any case.
Okay, we'll take another couple questions here before moving on to Chapter 4. Who controls the data inputted into the Cool Farm tool? Does the food company that asks the farmer to use it, or is the data private and controlled by the farmer?
Excellent question. It's one of the big issues that we're always dealing with, and that we're very aware of. It's the farmer owning the data, and it's the farmer who can give permission to other people using the data in anonymous aggregated systems. So it should now be traced back to a particular farmer, and in any case it's his possession, and it's up to the farmer to decide whether or not to share it. There is as yet in the Cool Farm tool no aggregation level, so there is individual data that nobody else can touch except the farmer himself. But in future we'd like to collect data to get regional averages, to compare Florida to California. So we collect all the data from a particular region and make an average, compare that with another average. But that feature is being built but not done yet.
Okay, one more clarification. Could you clarify whether the Cool Farm tool accounts for carbon dioxide emissions reductions associated with the production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer if farmers reduce their fertilizer use?
Yes, it does. But that's where the big reward is, of course. I mean, if a farmer manages to reduce those external inputs, that really helps reduce emissions in general. So yes, that reward is in there, and it's part of the equation.
Okay. And is there any plan to make the yardstick available for other countries?
There is, what we're hoping to do in an ideal world would be to combine the best features of the Cool Farm tool with the best features of the Climate Yardstick. The Cool Farm tool is superior on crops. It's very good on crops, and it's got this huge database on fertilizers. The CLM Yardstick is better on animal production, and we really would like to combine the two. We're talking to a few people to try and see if we can do that. And then the second thing is the look and feel of the screen. The feedback we got from farmers is that they do like the Climate Yardstick that we built as being accessible and very, very easy to use. So combining the look and feel and the animal production side of the Climate Yardstick with the Cool Farm tool would be the best option. Making it available for other countries involves a lot of work in putting in background data from other countries than Denmark or the Netherlands, and we don't have clients for that at the moment.
Okay, we have a lot more questions here, but why don't we go ahead and take Gijs's chapter 4, and at the end we'll try to get to as many more of these questions as we can.
Right. It's not very much more, so we can go through this rapidly. More than carbon. Here's a machine spraying, of course, because what farmers are interested in is yield, margin, soil inputs like nitrogen, phosphates and pesticides. That's the stuff the farmer works with. That's the first thing he looks at. And the food companies are asking for climate change, water and biodiversity. Now for a farmer, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are really not his concern. And biodiversity is only if he's interested. It is his concern, but he's generally not aware, and it's very difficult. So for the companies, they're asked for different things, they're interested in different things than the farmer, so clearly combining all of this into one package makes life much more interesting for everybody. Now the Cool Farm tool is at the moment adding water footprint, which is in a sense also interesting for the farmer himself, but also something that the food companies are interested in. Biodiversity score and farm economy, especially the latter one, is not meant to collect data on the dollars for the food companies, but rather to make the tool more interesting for the farmer to see, okay, so if I reduce nitrogen inputs and improve organic matter in the soil, what does that mean economically? And I know we're still at the start on this. That's a really big challenge, and I'm not sure if we can put that into numbers, but at least we could have done it in pluses and minuses. And there are other tools around. The Farm Smart that I mentioned for dairy does include several issues, including eutrophication, and that is really interesting because they connect the nutrient balance to the local water situation. That means they have a lot of geo-survey data in there at the US level. A very interesting addition. Field to Market, that's the Keystone Institute, have a rather broad tool which covers some other issues, has some drawbacks too. Then that's the Field to Market is mainly for the big commodity crops, and there's a stewardship index for specialty crops, also US based, which covers most essential issues. There is, and these are the ones that we've looked in detail at tools that are available and that are broadly applicable. These are the ones that keep coming up. I had to show you this picture. It's very Dutch with a harrier, but the meal, of course, in the back, as a symbol for the biodiversity that I'm going to talk about. A few more sheets now about biodiversity, and that's it. Because this is what we're doing at the moment, and it's almost ready for launch. We're putting in biodiversity as a calculator. Now, how can you measure biodiversity? Well, there's 3 ways of measuring it. You look at pressure factors. Think, what's the environmental situation? You know, amount of water, the toxicity, the land use, etc. Those are the pressure factors. You could look at the conditions on the farm. How much natural area, landscape elements, hedges, ponds, ditches and brooks. And what is the farmer doing on the farm? Delay mowing, field margins, and care for animals and plants. Or you can go down into the biology and start counting species of beetles, birds or butterflies. The pressure factors are the basic conditions, but that's very indirect and abstract. the natural conditions and management effort bring it close to habitats and the condition for species on the farm. They're visible and they're concrete. And the number of species are actual measurement of biodiversity from abstract to concrete, but the pressure factor is not accurate enough. And the number of species in the bottom, they're just too complex. No farmer is going to count butterflies or beetles. It's not going to work, even if biologists say that's what biodiversity is. So the workable proxy for measuring biodiversity on the farm is not looking at the plants and animals, but at the conditions that you're offering them. And that's what the Cool Farm tool is doing. I'm going to skip this one, but we look at 6 compartments, 3 in the productive area, 3 in non-productive area, and then from the narrow livestock to the cultivation. This is the philosophy behind it, but for time reasons I'm skipping this one. This is what it looks like now in the dummy. You start your biodiversity assessment by looking at, in the left hand you see livestock, field functional, field agrarian, small natural areas. These are the 6 categories that I just mentioned here. And in those 6 categories you get a range of questions. Questions like, oh, this is the result page. Questions like, which measure do you take to favor field flora, fauna? For instance, artificial fertilizer is not used on grain, so there's a list of questions that the farmer can tick. And for each positive yes, each tick, there's a point. So the more measures the farmer takes to favor biodiversity, the higher the score. And then the results page, of course, shows in a graph the results in those 6 dimensions. Now this way of asking questions is a rough estimate of potential biodiversity. So what you're asking a farmer is, what are you doing in your field and farm? And the experts have then extrapolated from that the potential biodiversity that could be on the farm. We're not counting, we're not actually. That's easy, but you're not sure about the outcome. Next step, oh yeah, okay. To the left bottom you can see this says CLM Yardstick, Gaia Biodiversity. This is the tool we built 2 years ago that we're using in the Netherlands with Ben & Jerry's, for instance, and with McCain in the field. So this is the approach that we are using, easy but unsure. Now what we're doing is combine our knowledge and our tool with the knowledge of University of Cambridge and apply that into a Cool Farm tool. That is easy, but it's got much more evidence of outcomes because Cambridge has collected 200 peer-reviewed literature research, used all that data to put into one big database where we could compare the effectivity. So here we have effectivity scores of particular measures. The measures to the right, to the left, and there's a score that eventually to the right, marked with the oval, gives a value to the measure. So plant nectar flower mix got a weight of 2, raising water levels of grassland at a rate of 1, and taking field corners out of management. We don't know if it's effective, so it's got a score of 0. So to the simple scoring of the CLM Yardstick, we've now added a scientifically based weighting system to increase accuracy. And that's going to be the basis for biodiversity in the Cool Farm tool to be launched somewhere this spring. Concluding, my last sheet is the wish list for a good tool. In this order, for the farmer includes this: farm economy, nutrient balances, pesticide scores, soil, water, biodiversity, and greenhouse gas emissions. So for the farmer, this is the order of interest I think he has when you look at impact on the farm economy, on the yield, and eventually on the environment. And we've started at the bottom with greenhouse gas and biodiversity and water. Those are socially important. They're important for society. That's what we think are important. We bring these together in one single tool, the 7 issues. We've got the perfect tool, and we're on our way. Long way to go, but we're getting there.
All right, so back to the questions. If anybody has more on that last section, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, I will keep going with the ones we've already got. So in thinking about agroecological systems, for instance, diversified alley cropping, are there tools to estimate greenhouse gas emissions under those scenarios?
The cool farm tool is product-based. So that's soybean, fill in the ones for soybean, and then the potatoes, and then the sunflowers. That is a drawback. The climate yardstick CLM is farm-based. We're adding up all the crops that are on the farm and then get one single farm result. But we don't have the statistics for agroecological systems combining crops. That's really difficult. That wouldn't be accurate in neither of the tools at the moment.
Okay, and there's a comment that someone was hoping you could address. Pepsi does not report emissions from the farm level publicly, and they don't require their suppliers to use these tools. While they're a member of the Cool Farm Institute, we need to remember that companies are only making these tools voluntarily available to their suppliers, and these tools, measurement and reductions should be required. Do you have a comment to respond to that?
If you want accurate numbers, you need farmers to honestly fill in the tool. If you make it a requirement, either that they have to fill it in order to be able to sell the crop, or even that their numbers will eventually be collected so that the client can go back to the farmer saying, you're not performing very well. You make it into something compulsory and you will get numbers that are not correct but do sound nice. So the voluntary approach is essential to getting the right numbers, and we're hoping to have an educational effect. We're hoping to have farmers getting more insight and understanding what's happening, and sometimes being able to do very good things without that it costs any money, or even sometimes it saves costs and environmental pressure. So yes, the food companies are not forcing anybody, because that wouldn't work.
Great. So what needs to happen, in your opinion, to climate smart agriculture so that it does not become sustainable intensification, supported by nanotechnology and so on, or the raw material for emissions offset credits in the financial markets?
I was afraid that would be coming. When you put a dilemma in, somebody asks, so what's the solution to it? I don't know. I do know that we should tell everybody who's talking about intensive agriculture that we should first look at the soil. And if the soil is not capable of performing in 10, 20, 30 years time, we might as well stop. And that's probably, the soil is the crux where everything comes together. And I'm happy to say that within Site Platform, at least, within the specialists that I meet within Site Platform, they are aware of the importance of soil. So we probably should shy away from labeling the schools of thought and just say we need a resilient agriculture that can perform efficiently, and soil is key to that, and that's the way of framing it. And the second one is looking at more than just field and farm level, looking at what they call the landscape level and the watershed, understanding the connection with the people and the soil and the water and the region and the biodiversity of that region. That's even further away, but I do see discussions arising, including food companies who are interested in this. So I put that on the horizon as the promising picture where all the interests come together, soil and the landscape approach.
So someone wants to know if you're familiar with the Comet Farm tool developed by Colorado State University. It seems to be the tool of choice for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And if you are familiar with it, can you compare it with the Cool Farm tool?
Could you say that name again?
Comet Farm?
No.
Okay.
I don't know that. 4 years ago, we did a scan of lots of existing tools, about 100 of them. That's Comet, C-O-M-I-C?
C-O-M-E-T.
Oh, Comet. It doesn't ring a bell, and therefore no comment for now. Interesting though. So if anybody wants to share that kind of information and links, that would be a good idea, IATP, if you could collect some, if people want to share some stuff that would be nice.
Okay, and then we have a question. Is there one resource where companies can go to understand best practice in measuring dairy emissions?
Well, the good thing about dairy is that they're probably the best organized sector at a global scale. They have very good cooperation in International Dairy Forum, the International Global Dairy Platform. They have chosen about 20 indicators that for them should be the indicators for sustainability. I'll have to look that up, what that's called, this global agenda for sustainability or something. So the international dairy industry is cooperating on this, and they're very much aligned, much more, for instance, than arable or potato industry.
Where would you recommend investing in Tier 3 methodologies, direct measures to the farm, to supplement on-farm modeling Tier 2 tools like the Cool Farm tool?
Sorry, I am the generalist of the lot here. That one goes to the expert. Sorry, I can't answer that.
All right. So here is more of a general question. Is the problem of feeding the world more about lack of food storage and transport and waste than growing efficiency?
Yes, I would say so. If 33% of food is lost according to FAO, and we can reduce that by half, then we have a 15 to 20% increase in production of food, because we're not wasting it anymore. I would guess that that would be a more effective way of increasing availability of food than trying to raise it on the field, because the increase in production, at least in Western systems, is just 0.5 to 1% per year. So at least in intensive systems, we can't get any faster than that. So yes, the yield gap is easiest covered by post-harvest losses and post-consumer losses.
So with the Cool Farm tool, can that be used to calculate the carbon footprint of farms in different countries?
Yes. Yeah, that's what it's for.
Yes.
The trick is that you'd have, normally farmers will fill it in with their own angle. So not entirely comparable, but anyway, they're asking for the same inputs. You're using the same methodology and you're getting the same output in the same formats and the same units. So yeah, that's the trick. And that would be very interesting to see the differences and especially the changes over the years.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we are just about out of time for today. For those of you who asked, this webinar was recorded and it will be available on the IATP website and YouTube channel. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Gijs, for sharing your expertise. We'll follow up after this webinar, so if there are remaining questions, there will be an opportunity to have them answered. And with that, thank you everybody for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks everybody.